Okay, I've also been asked to speak a little bit more about perseveration. One of the things that's interesting is that, perseveration has a direct overlap with what we call obsessive compulsive disorders. And what we've discovered over time and through brain scans, there's similarities, between people who obsess and people who perseverate. Okay? And so one of the things that's important to understand is perseveration is potentially a search for that kind of neurological closure that I described before. And perseveration also is a quest for sameness, because familiarity allows all of us to feel comfortable and to have a sense of personal mastery over ourself and our environment. But perseveration can create a lot of problems. When you have an individual who's a rigid thinker who becomes stuck and cannot become unstuck, it really sets limits and restrictions on their life, and it makes it very difficult to deal with an individual who is perseverating. So, how does one begin to address issues of perseveration? Number one, going back to the issue of priming that I spoke before, if you have a child who is playing with his or her favorite toy and you want to interrupt them midstream because you have something else on your agenda, don't do it. Number one, you have to give that child a clear sense that there is a discrete ending coming to their play activity that they can anticipate. So one of the ways we deal with, ceasing an activity for kids with autism is not only priming them, but for some children literally using a clock and letting them know that they have 5 more minutes and setting a timer, and that they recognize that when their timer goes off that it's time to transition. Sometimes, instead of using a clock, we do it through a discrete activity. So if we have a child who is playing with the train in a repetitive manner and is stuck over and over and doing the same thing with the train, one of the things we might do is to let the child know that he or she has 5 more times that they can run the train across the tracks, but when the 5th time is completed, it's done. For kids who have less language, you would use visual means to give them a sense of closure. You would use a concrete basis for letting them know that limits are being set on their activity. Now, when you're looking at individuals who are verbal and who are perseverating and stuck and thinking about the same thing over and over, you need to go about that in a different way. One of the things that I do for kids who can't stop talking about something or engaging in a particular behavior is I prescribe that behavior, but I set limits on it. So for instance, if you have a kid who is worried about what happened at school and whether another particular child likes them after they've had a tiff with one another, what I would do is first of all prescribe a certain time of the day that that child's allowed to think about that, and it's off limits the rest of the time. I teach them how to distract and redirect their thinking. I would teach them that sometimes when they're stuck in thinking about a particular thing or playing with a particular object, if they move to another physical environment, sometimes just physical relocation is able to break the perseverative cycle. I would begin also to teach individuals to recognize when they're stuck. And as I mentioned earlier, often people with autism have difficulty self-monitoring or self-evaluating. I would create a template to allow an individual to see when he or she is perseverating, and I would give them overt signals that they could use to determine when they're engaged in that process, and then I would also get them to evaluate for themselves whether or not they find this to be particularly helpful or not. Because ultimately, just like everyone else, individuals with autism are pragmatists. We do things for a reason and to meet our particular needs. So when you want to dissuade a child from engaging in a repetitive behavior, not only do you set clear limits for beginning and ending it, and set physical environments where it's acceptable, so therefore you preempt it so it becomes an appropriate behavior rather than a wholly inappropriate behavior, but you also begin to evaluate whether or not that behavior works for themselves. Sometimes I have kids who come in and see me and they tell me their mind's just stuck and there's nothing they can do about it. So in essence, teaching someone how to contend with his or her own perseveration is empowering to them, but it needs to be done in an incremental and concrete ways. You teach an individual not only how to distract or redirect his or her thinking, but when you have an individual stuck on something, you segue them into a preferential or motivated activity, so when they're leaving something, they aren't just leaving, they're going somewhere where they wish to go. And so you have to deal with issues of perseveration based upon an individual's particular developmental status, what they're perseverating on, what function the perseveration serves, and there's no clear recipe for dealing with perseveration. But most of us know, because we all obsess to varying degrees, you know, some of us are more anxious than others and manifest our behavior in that manner, that there are real values at times of being stuck on things and over-focused, but you reach a point of diminishing returns, and once you recognize that, it's vital to move on. And one of the other ways to diminish perseveration is by broadening the range of a person's interests and behaviors. So if you have a wider range of pleasurable activities to engage in, it's easier not to be stuck on one thing, and it's easier to distract yourself or to accept redirection from others when you happen to be stuck.